We think women need to talk more openly about money because money really matters. It shouldn't be embarrassing or confusing. Join the conversation. We'll be discussing a whole range of topics which will help you get comfortable with your finances. Money Matters, brought to you by AJ Bell. Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Money Matters podcast. I'm Laura Suter, and I'm joined, as always, by Danni Hewson. Hi, Danni.
Hi, Laura. Now, I know that we've got one more podcast episode to bring you before the Christmas break, but I have to say, I've had my first mince pie. We've opened the advent calendar here, and I'm feeling a bit festive. How about you?
Yes, me too. We've not decorated the house yet, and I'm actually normally I hold off until quite late, but I'm quite keen to do it. I did some Christmas crafting last night. It's all been very nice.
We put the tree up over the weekend, which is always, I think, the sign that Christmas is here, and it does make you festive. And we had some carols on, and it was all very twee and lovely.
And mulled wine, I hope.
Red wine, no mould, but I've got to build up to that. Yeah.
And we've got an early Christmas gift for everyone else as well, because Danni has been chatting to the rather excellent Scummy Mummies.
Yeah, if you haven't come across this comedy duo before, they are definitely a force. They're not afraid of very bluntly sharing the good and bad of their parenting experiences. They've written books, they've got their own award-winning podcast, and are currently smack in the middle of a UK tour.
So stick around for that chat later. And I know one of the things that both women spoke about so passionately is the current cost of living crisis, which is making things incredibly tough for a lot of people.
And our last couple of pods, we have drafted in some brilliant women to try and help you cut the cost of Christmas, find the best bargains, just to make that money stretch a bit further. So do seek those out wherever you listen to your podcast for some great tips. But the bottom line is Christmas is expensive, more so than ever this year because of inflation. And we know lots of people will have decided to put at least some of their Christmas on credit.
Yeah, and I think there's no point in us sitting here saying all debt is bad, don't use debt. We've never done that. I think the reality is that some people are going to need to put some of their Christmas costs on credit. And I think we just want to talk you through the ways to do that so that you don't go into New Year with a massive debt hangover.
Yeah, because you've been talking about personal finance for years, and debt is something that always comes up at Christmas time. And you're absolutely right. People will be putting some things on credit. There are ways to deal with credit effectively, not land in a great big hole. But of course, there are also huge pitfalls. So if people are heading out now to the stores, they've got more things to buy. They're going to be using credit cards, buy now, pay later, even just dipping into overdraft. What would you say to them? What do they need to be thinking about if they've put Christmas on credit? What next?
So I think the first thing is to think consciously about where you're putting that debt. So if you know that you're going to have to turn to some form of debt this Christmas, think about where you're putting that and get the cheapest option possible. So rather than doing what so many of us do, which is kind of slipping into your overdraft, which actually is a really expensive form of debt now. That's got most overdrafts have about 40% interest on them if you don't have an interest-free amount. So that's actually a really expensive form of debt. So if you know that you're going to have to put money on debt, seek out things like an interest-free credit card where you can get an interest-free period for it, or just kind of the cheapest option of debt that you can find, because then that means when you're making repayments, more of that money will go to paying off the actual debt that you took out, the initial cost of the item, rather than just going to really high interest charges. And then I think the next thing is to just keep track of payments. So if you're putting stuff on credit, making a note of when those credit card repayments are going to be, setting up a direct debit if you can, because then that automates it. Lots of people will be using buy now, pay later. It's really tricky to keep track of all of those payments, particularly if you're buying lots of different items with different providers. You really need to be making a note of when you're meant to pay those so that you don't miss any payments. And I think that's the big thing, is kind of being a bit more organized about it, maybe making a note of those dates and making sure that you don't miss those payments. And then I think it's kind of thinking about how you're going to pay that money off ultimately. So you might think this is a problem for 2023. I don't have a prospect of repaying it before the end of the year, but it's thinking about, where am I going to find that money? Are there some things that I've been meaning to sell for a while that I could put on things like Vinted or Facebook Marketplace and flog them to make a bit of extra money? Or is it things like, Danni, I remember you talking about this before, council tax payments. You usually only pay 10 months of payments. So then you have 2 months of the year where you're not paying your council tax. Can you consciously put exactly the same amount of money that you would have been paying for your council tax towards, credit card bills or paying off overdraft? And it's kind of thinking through some of those things. Is there a chance of getting overtime at work, or will you have a bonus? And kind of coming up with a strategy for how you might repay that money so that your Christmas shopping isn't still keeping you awake at night with worry come summer next year.
Yeah, I must admit that is something that saved me last year, because I fell foul of the whole buying something and expecting that it had already come out of your account. So with some payment methods like PayPal, it says that you pay once the goods have been dispatched, and that could be 2, even 3 weeks later. And of course, you're buying it, and I hadn't realized that I'd hit that button, assumed it had come out of my account, and then suddenly I'm finding this payment for 300 quid out of nowhere for a bunch of Christmas presents. And yes, it does throw you, and it is so easy to get caught out. But, the bills start to come in, of course, don't they? And we all know that the best action is definitely to pay it off in full so that you don't rack up any charges if you've used a credit card. But that's not something most of us are going to be able to do. So what should we prioritize?
So there are 2 ways that you can repay debt: the snowball and the avalanche. So the avalanche is where you list all of your debt by the most expensive to the cheapest. So the highest interest rate that you're paying on the debt all the way down to the cheapest, regardless of how much you owe on that form of debt. And then what you do is you pay off the most expensive first. Once you've paid off that, you then move down to the next one. The alternative is the snowball. So this is where you list your debt by the largest amount and the smallest amount. And then you tackle that smaller amount of debt first, and you pay that off, and you prioritize your overpayments on that until you've paid that off, and then you move to the next one. There are different mentalities here. The avalanche effect is the most kind of financially prudent. It means that you're tackling that high cost debt first. And so then it means more of your overpayments are going to go towards, further down the line, are going to go towards paying off the actual debt rather than the interest. But the snowball effect can have a really positive mental impact, because if you've got a small bit of debt, maybe a couple of £100 on a credit card or in an overdraft, and you can pay that off, then the kind of real feel good feeling that you get from that can spur you on to pay off the rest of your debt. So there are 2 different options, but the golden rule is you should always pay your minimum payments while doing this. So meet the minimum payments on all of your debt and then pick which option you want.
And I guess the key thing is just to make sure, as you say, that you've got it all written down somewhere, the dates that everything is coming out, so that you're not caught out, and you don't get caught out by these odd quirks of payments where you think you've paid them and actually you haven't, and then it lands on you in January, and maybe your paycheck has come a bit earlier, so suddenly you've got a whole lot more month at the end of the money. What happens if things get really bad? Because there is a lot of help out there. So what should people do?
So my first thing that I always signpost is Citizens Advice. They're really good because they can look across all of your finances. So they can look not just at the debt part, and they have specialist debt advisors to help with that, but they can also look at, is there extra government support that you could be claiming, any benefits that you could be claiming, tax breaks, things like that. And they'll help you find, extra sources of money that you might not be aware that you're entitled to. After that, I think it would be going to kind of a specialist debt charity, so things like step change. The things that you want to make sure are that you're not paying for this advice. So there's so many charities out there that offer free advice. So don't go to anyone who wants to try and charge you to consolidate your debt, or go to a private company that's trying to charge you for this service. There's so many free options out there. And even if it's initially just getting a bit of advice on what you could do, you don't have to think that just making that one call means you're going to be committed to a debt repayment plan, or that you're going to have to take some drastic action straight away. Often it can just be, seeking a bit of advice, working out a few things that you could do, and then doing that in your own time.
Being honest with yourself, I guess. I mean, I know it's really hard, and if you're really worried about it, you're probably not sleeping, and it can be hard to make that first step and to talk to people about it, because you feel guilty and maybe a bit ashamed, but it is really, really important that you just start that conversation. And I suppose, we're still a few weeks from Christmas when we're recording this. People will still be thinking about all of those things that they want to buy and maybe adding to their debt. And I've heard so many conversations this year. I've had conversations this year with family and friends talking about, do you know what? Normally we'd buy a present for this teacher, that instructor, the next door neighbours. Maybe this year we won't. Or this year, instead of, spending 20, £30 on something that they don't want, we'll set a target and say, right, we're just going to spend £5 on each other and just give something really small, a token. And I think we've always done that in our family. We've always had, for the adults, we've set a limit and we say, right, well, we'll just buy each other a bottle of wine or something, and we'll buy for the kids. And that just means that Christmas isn't quite as expensive as it could be.
Yeah, and I think that one good thing to come out of this kind of cost of living crisis is that everyone's talking about how much more expensive things are and ways to cut costs. And I think it means that some of those tricky conversations maybe are a bit easier to have this year. My group of friends and I, between us, we have approximately 1 million children. And so we decided this year that we're not going to buy for each other's kids. Most of them are too young to kind of really get it anyway. And it ends up not only being a cost, but just the hassle of thinking of different presents for different age kids and working out what they like adds to that kind of mental load and stress of Christmas. So we decided no more. We'll do birthday presents, but we're not doing Christmas presents. And actually, that's a big relief, both financially and also I don't have to think of a present for an 8-year-old girl who I saw 6 months ago.
What you said earlier about Vinted really struck a chord, because I went out for a meal with a group of mums that I've known since our kids were teeny tiny, and my eldest is now 16, so it's been a long time. And 2 of them were showing off tops that they'd bought off Vinted. And it has become really not just acceptable, but laudable to be buying things secondhand, because, of course, you're helping with the environmental issues that come from, making huge amounts of extra clothes. A lot of it goes to landfill, but also saving cash. It's just kind of savvy.
Yeah, it's really good. I use it for all of my daughter's clothes because kids aren't in clothes for that long, particularly shoes. So you can get really decent quality stuff for very cheap. But if you've got any questions for us on the podcast, then do get in touch. And if you've got friends who you think might enjoy the podcast or get something from it, then do definitely tell them to listen. Ask them to sign up to the newsletter as well. But for now, our promised guests for this week are the Scummy Mummies.
Yes, I was very excited to chat to them both. This comedy duo met when they had young kids. They quickly gained a huge following, brutally honest about motherhood. But they were just as brutally honest about the state of the economy when I caught up with Helen Thorn and Ellie Gibson in the middle of their UK tour. So I suppose really just to kick it off, you guys are not scared at all about tackling taboo subjects. Just looking at your podcast list, I don't think there's a subject you haven't tackled, and money is among them. Helen, why do you think money is still a taboo subject, and how do you feel about money?
Oh, I think there's still such a big hang up about money, and especially as women, and it has been very gendered for very, very long. And the tide is turning. Like there's some amazing sort of female voices on social media who are talking about money. But I think it is, and we've been ingrained in this sort of culture, especially in the UK. It's like, oh, it's impolite to talk about salaries, and it's impolite to talk about earnings and things like that. And also that it's a very patriarchal society, and we're like, oh, you're looked after by your husband. And so for most of us, we weren't really taught about it in schools. Our mothers didn't talk about it to us. So I think we're having to do the big ask, the big change, and changing that culture. But what I find really refreshing is that you start the conversation very quietly, like, oh, we're business women, or we're mums who are just trying to go out for ourselves. And the more you talk about it, the easier it gets. So I'm glad this podcast exists, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation.
Because Ellie, I know for you guys it is about tackling really tricky subjects and getting people to open up. And when you're touring and people are giving their confessions, how often does money come up?
So for anyone who doesn't know, so basically at the end of our show, we give all the audience a card and a pen, and we ask them to share like a scummy mummy confession. And it's usually a sort of story of parenting failure. And we get some some things that are far too filthy to say on this platform. People might be eating their breakfast. Do you know what I mean? Probably too much. But I'll be honest, we do have a lot of common themes, and money, I would say, probably is not one of them, actually. And I think that's quite interesting, isn't it? Is that people seem quite happy to talk about their hangovers, or their sex life, or their marital problems, or their terrible children. But actually, no, I don't think money does come up. And I wonder if that's because, as Helen was just saying, I wonder how much of that is to do with the fact that 99% of our audience is women, and we do still have a sort of social stigma around talking about it. I'm not sure.
One of the things that comes up is about time out. And I think you could almost say that is loosely related to money. Like one of our most favorite confessions is that mums will often say, I tell my childminder or my mother-in-law that I'm going to work or working from home, and I actually go to the gym and I play Candy Crush. So it's about, carving out time for yourself. And and interesting, that's a similar taboo to money, in that we feel guilty about putting ourselves first. And so I think that sometimes gets the biggest cheer, doesn't it, Ellie? Where people kind of they've sort of snuck off, and especially during the pandemic, they're saying, "I said I had a meeting, but I actually went to my shed and watched Married at First Sight." And it lasted for like 6 months, which I think is brilliant. But it also tells you about our worth and our value, in terms of what we need this time out. We need to prioritize, our mental health and probably our financial health. But it's still a bit of a secret. And the fact that we feel like we've won by sneaking it is quite telling.
Yeah, because I know that, well, we've done some research which suggests that, if women came into a bit of money, they wouldn't invest it in the same way that men would. They would spend it on their kids, or on holidays, or making sure that their family was supported, rather than looking after their future. And I suppose, Ellie, that women do tend to put their kids and their families first.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we all have that inclination, don't we? And it's quite interesting. So my background is in video games, right? I used to be a video games journalist, and so I know from years of working in that industry that when there is a recession, as in fear there might be about to be, when times are hard, in terms of once people have paid their food and their heating bills, the money, whatever's left over, does go on the kids. So that's why video games as an industry always does, actually, compared to some other industries, doesn't suffer too much when times are hard, because parents, and often it's mums who are buying the presents, right, the Christmas presents or whatever, or looking for something to occupy the kids, they will still put the kids first, and they won't go out to eat, they won't buy a new pair of shoes, but they'll buy a video game because that will keep their child occupied for up to like 40-50 hours. So that's something I've definitely seen sort of come out in real life. That's a practical example of that.
And right now, there are not going to be a whole load of women who are, and men, but obviously we're talking to women, we're talking to mums who are talking about buying Christmas presents for their kids and having really tricky conversations with their kids about what they can afford. And I know you both have done a podcast where you've got your kids talking about money and dealing about money, but sometimes it can be really hard, particularly if you're ashamed.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, especially when the children are little and, where they think their Christmas presents are coming from. That's a very difficult conversation. When they're a bit older, my children are 11 and 14, and I have sat them down. I said, this year's going to be different. There's not going to be lots of presents, but why don't we think about having a group family present? Like we need new TV. So maybe that's our Christmas present to ourselves. And then I'll just buy you about 18 kilos of sweets. How about that? And they're like, woohoo! Bribe them with sugar. But yeah, I think it's really good to start those conversations about money very early, because I think there's really unrealistic expectations on children, and also the media floods you. We've already started to see all the Christmas ads, and the magic of Christmas seems to be abundance. The magical Christmas is associated with excess, and massive tables of food, massive decorations, ridiculous Christmas jumpers. And to kind of translate that into reality for your children is a tricky task.
Now, I have no problem with massive tables of food, it has to be said, because, I like to get stuck in. However, it's hard, particularly if you're, struggling to have the oven on to roast for a long period of time. I don't ever remember a time quite like this. I mean, I remember during the financial crisis, I wasn't working in finance, and I was one of those people that had to go around a supermarket with a calculator and say, okay, have I got enough to do the shop, to pay for all this stuff that my family needs? And I know you guys are now incredibly successful, but I guess it wasn't always the case, Ellie.
No, absolutely not. And my first experience of that, of course, because growing up, we never had a lot of money, but yes, there was always food on the table. And I remember being aware of sometimes being harder than others, and yes, having these conversations about Christmas, but we always did okay. But then I went to university and I didn't really know how to manage money or budget, or, so I did that classic first term thing of, my parents had definitely given me adequate money to live on, but I sort of spaffed it all on, cigarettes and glittery shoes, and and then it got to the end of term and I had no money, and I was really ashamed and I was really embarrassed to say to my parents, look, I've really screwed this up, and I didn't want to get a credit card because I did at least know enough that was that way madness lay. So I ended up sort of just living off toast and cheese slices and the cheapest spreadable butter in the supermarket for the last 2 weeks of term. And that was when I was in an overdraft. And I remembered that feeling of something, although I was an idiotic 18-year-old, clearly something rang a bell in my head going, this is really bad. You feel bad all the time and you don't ever want to be here again. And I've been lucky enough that I have had hard times since, but I have moved back in with my parents, or I've been on the dole, or I've done all that, and I've never been that much on the breadline again. But I know that a lot of people don't have that choice; they don't have that option. That's where they are, and my heart absolutely goes out to those people. And I think it's disgraceful, frankly, that we're in this situation. That the people in power they've basically done what I did, and made really terrible decisions and really screwed it up. But now the difference is, when I screwed it up, I was the one who suffered. Now millions of people are suffering. I think it's disgraceful.
God, some of the stories you hear at the moment, Helen, are just utterly devastating. The idea of heating or eating. For me, I just can't even begin to imagine what that's like.
Yeah, and I work with the charity Gingerbread, who represent and are advocates for single parents. And there's been an increase, I think about 50% increase in their helpline. And most of the calls are people saying, I have to make the choice of whether to turn on my fridge or, feed the children. And one of the big things that happens when we're in this financial crisis that maintenance payments aren't being paid to mothers. So mothers are really very much suffering at this point, and children, of course. And that's absolutely heartbreaking. And there are mothers that aren't eating. They will, again, like we were talking about, feed their children. And so, childcare costs are going up, and salaries and people's hours are being reduced, and people are really, really struggling. And as Ellie said, we should not be in this situation at all. And that's what's really, really difficult. And then, of course, schools are being cut as well, and the free school meals that were going to happen over the holidays, that has just been sort of silently disappeared. So, I think we have to look out for our, food banks are going up, all those sort of things. So we have to be really conscious of what's going on around us. We basically need a new government, ladies. I think that's it. Get this one out, because there's unnecessary suffering.
I'm going to shove us away from politics now, and I'm going to talk about financial mistakes. And
well, I'm not really sure. I mean, surely those themes at the moment, they're quite concurrent, aren't they? It's hard to separate those two issues out, one could argue. If we're going to
segue, maybe.
Giant financial mistakes. Don't know if you've watched the news in the last couple of months. Don't know if you've seen any news. There's been some financial mistakes, mate. There have been some, yes. And they weren't mine. Let's say that. They weren't my mistakes.
Talk about a Freudian slip, eh? Yeah.
No finger pointing. No, not at all.
But I don't know how you can talk about money, honestly, without talking about politics, especially if you're talking about people in crisis, especially if you're talking about people on the breadline. Because I think sometimes we can fall into the trap of, it's just happened, as if the economy is just this sort of amorphous, independent being that just sort of does all this crazy stuff and we all just have to tolerate it. And that's not true. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And that's the result of decisions that have been made by people in power. That is not some accidental, thing. And it might be to do with Ukraine, and it might be to do with Brexit, and it might be to do with all these factors. But at the end of the day, people are responsible for those things. And now I promise, this is me getting off my soapbox, Danny. Now I've said that. Now I'll settle down and behave. We can talk about Black Friday or whatever you like. I don't know.
Well, I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit, because I was listening to a previous podcast episode that you did. And it was a couple of years ago now, but you said at the time that you didn't have a pension. Has that changed?
Me, I do not have a pension, no. That is on the advice of my financial advisor. I've got savings, I've got a bit of money invested, and I've got my house. And we looked at the options, and it didn't make financial sense to do that at that time. And I will revisit it over the years. But currently the plan is different. Are you you're going to have a go at me, Danny? Go on.
No, I'm not actually, because everybody's circumstances are different. And, the whole thing is that if you get advice and that advice then works for you and your situation, then that is absolutely brilliant. For me, it's, we were talking about time out earlier, and there are an awful lot of women that take time out from the workplace and stop paying into their pension and then never start again, but don't have the luxury or the ability, or it maybe doesn't even occur to them to talk to a financial advisor and say, okay, I've got my future ahead of me. Where do I stand?
And I think that's right. I have a small pension, which I'm now starting to add small amounts into. But I was married, and my ex-husband said, "You don't need a pension. I'm going to look after you," which was one of the many lies. But anyway,
I'm not going to mention my secret bank account.
Exactly.
That's
right.
Another story for another time.
different podcast, but yeah, so I had to face that. And when I wrote my book, Get Divorced, Be Happy, I made sure I had a whole chapter devoted to finance and getting back, taking ownership of yourself as a single person, because I think so many of us haven't had that sort of conversation with ourselves and thought, that's part of the marital pot sort of thing. But yeah, I'm very, very much now conscious, especially as my work as a freelance comedian, and I work for myself and I work with Ellie primarily. I'm like, will I still be wearing a catsuit when I'm 60 and dancing about a stage, talking about my probably even lower boobs at that stage? And so I am very conscious of that. And before, when I was a young person, I thought, the steps are, I'll get married, we'll buy a house together, and then we'll look after each other. But now I don't see that at all. I do not want to rely on a single other person for my future, because I've been sort of fundamentally changed by my divorce. So I think that has been good, and a lot of people said after reading that chapter that's been, it's been that thing about, see no evil, hear no evil. I don't want to know about it, but you have to know about it, really.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Because we are sort of, I'm trying not to with my girls, but certainly I think when I was growing up, I was sold the fairy tale that you would, you'd go to university, you'd get a job, but then you'd get married and your husband would look after you, or at least you would look after each other. And that fairy tale sometimes doesn't have a happy ending.
I mean, I almost had the opposite growing up, because my dad was a comedian and an actor, which meant most of the time he was an out-of-work comedian and actor. And my mum, she was the reliable breadwinner. She was the one who had she taught for a long time, and she wrote books, and she did this, and she had a market stall, and she did all these things that were things that she did every week to bring the money in, so there was always money. And to be fair, my dad did that as well. He did supply teaching, or he did motorbike couriering. So I watched these people who didn't have conventional, traditional paths to careers. They weren't lawyers or doctors or, shop managers or whatever, but they sort of made it work. But they were sort of a partnership, but predominantly it was my mum who was bringing the money in. So I kind of grew up this kind of thing of, right, you've got to make your own money. You've got to always do your own thing. And excellently, I also now make more money than my husband. So that's worked out really well for me.
I've learned a lot about money, but also asking for money and being bold about money through Ellie, because Ellie had been a freelancer, for a long time before me, but also she's obviously got this amazing grounding from her parents. And before I divorced, I didn't have my own bank account. I had a joint bank account, and all our finances were just sort of in together. And I remember her, I don't think she physically shook me, Ellie. I don't think you took hand to me, but you did sort of shake me in other ways.
When you were still married, I found that you told me that you didn't have your own bank account, and I was horrified. I was sort of like, no, and I couldn't understand how you could live with it, because I like the feeling of having my own money and having what my husband affectionately calls a go fund. So if you ever need to just get out, you've got enough money in the bank to go. He's like, if one of us is accused of murder, and I'm like, I don't feel like that's likely, but I know what he means. I've always liked the security of. So yeah, I was to be honest, as you know, Helen, I was slightly astonished when you said you didn't have one, but then you got one. So I
did. Look at me growing up.
The one thing I love about you is that you're not afraid to grow up disgracefully, and you're not afraid to be honest, and you're not afraid to tackle absolutely everything. And are you aware how much good you do with your podcast? How many women you actually help to deal with some really dark times in their lives?
Well, I'm glad that there's one thing you like about us. That's good. That's the one thing. The rest of it, not the jokes or anything, No, I'm being facetious. We're sort of aware, because we're very grateful to get a lot of messages from people saying on Instagram or on email, saying what you've just said, which is really lovely, saying that we've helped them. And that is of course that's hugely ego stroking, but it's also hugely gratifying, because that isn't something we ever set out to do. We never started any of it we weren't like, we're going to help people and we're going to get them through the dark times. We'd be like, do you want to meet up once a fortnight, and as an excuse to get drunk, just make a podcast? And then it sort of snowballed. So to hear that we never try to inform or educate, but apparently we accidentally do. So that's been a great bonus. Of course, that's hugely personally satisfying, and it's what has helped keep us going, motivated us for 9 years, coming up 10.
Thank you both so much for taking part in this podcast and, sharing your thoughts on politics and finance. I'm glad we managed to get the soapbox out a bit. I'm hoping that we might get some glitzy wigs out when we get to our confessional a bit later. But for now, thank you both so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The Scummy Mummies there, and if you haven't listened to their podcast, do seek them out. And their UK tour is on right now and runs all the way through next year. I just wanted to add to what Ellie and I spoke about with regard to pensions. Now, because she sought financial advice, and if you can, that is always brilliant because, of course, everybody's financial circumstance is different. But for most people, a pension is going to be the most tax efficient way of saving for your retirement. I said I was getting on my soapbox. If you're employed, also remember that you're getting extra money from your employer and the government. And if you can start saving up early, then little amounts can become a really significant pot of cash.
And a spoiler alert that we'll probably be covering pensions next year, because in the new year, we're going to bring you lots of tips for the changes that you can make to your finances, the fairly quick, easy changes that you can make that are going to save you a lot of money or even make you money in 2023. So definitely catch that episode in the new year.
Yeah, giving finances a bit of a spring clean. That is quite topical because I have now the next instalment of our confessional this week from Helen and Ellie. And after everything we were just talking about, it is very apt. Here we go.
I don't put aside tax. I'm being very, very bad at it and become a freelancer. And then I'm also always surprised when I have to go, oh, yes, I was meant to save 30%. So that's my biggest. And then so I've had to pay fines on top of that. And that's something I've had to, really concentrate on because I get excited. I still feel like I'm 5 years old when the money lands in my account. I'm like, woohoo, what? I can buy Mars bars and new bras. I get very excited about money and I still very silly about it. So my biggest financial mistake is not putting enough away from tax and then going, oh gosh, I've got to pay it. So I think, and planning ahead, so Ellie and I, there's 12 months a year, but we only really work 9 months of the year because we don't work in school holidays. So I'll go, oh, I've got all this money in my account, but then realize during the school holidays, we don't earn any money. So when it gets to the end of the school holidays, the money has gone. So things like that. Yes, I probably got a whole list of confessions, but yeah, they're my top two.
Bras and Mars bars are really important. Is that where you're spending, Ellie?
Yeah, I like Mars bras. I don't know if
Yes.
you've ever had one of those. It's actually it's like chocolates to support your breasts. It's very nice. It does help you work, rest, and play. Let me tell you, there's a contemporary reference for you, showing the age. Well, the biggest financial mistake that I made was starting a business with someone who never puts money aside for tax or plans for the future. That's caused a lot of economic stress and difficulty for me personally and the company as a whole. So my advice would be don't do that.
So a bit of a cop-out from Ellie, but she did say, honestly, that her biggest mistakes were the ones that she talked about making when she was a student. But that big tax payment, Laura, in fact, just making sure that you have filed your tax return, it's a perennial, isn't it?
I know. And I just feel very fortunate that I've always been employed and I've never had to deal with, filing a tax return, because the number of people that I hear who kind of forget the deadline, my husband included, and end up with fines and the stress of having to fill it out, it just actually causes me anxiety, even though I don't have to do it, the thought of doing that. So it's so easily done, isn't it?
Well, I have to do it every year anyway because of the child benefit situation. So it's one of those things where if you're not earning the extra, you could get caught out. So do just take a minute to make sure that you don't need to file a tax return. If you do need to file a tax return, that date is fast approaching. Before we go, those scummies were quite critical of the government. In its cost of living support paper, the Treasury did say, we understand people are worried about the cost of living challenges ahead. That's why the government's announced decisive action to support households whilst remaining fiscally responsible. It went on to highlight a number of measures, including the additional £26 billion of targeted cost of living support, which will be made available next year, as well as the energy price guarantee, which caps the price that every household pays for energy. If you are in any doubt about the support that you are entitled to, do take a look on the government website.
But that is it for this week's episode. So thank you so much for listening. And do make sure that you subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you have a couple of minutes to leave us a review, that would also be great and helps other people find us. And on our next episode, I'll be chatting to the lovely author and journalist Laura Waitley about the havoc finances can play on relationships.
In the meantime, do drop us a message on Instagram at AJ Bell Money Matters is where you'll find us, or you can email us moneymatters@ajbell.co.uk.
Until next time, thanks for listening, and I'm off to get some mulled wine.
Before you go, please remember this podcast is for educational purposes, and the views expressed don't necessarily reflect those of AJ Bell. The podcast isn't telling you whether certain investments are suitable or not. And don't forget that the value of investments can change, and you can lose money as well as make it. It's also important to remember that tax rules apply, and that the way an investment performed in the past may not be the same as how it behaves in the future. If you want help, go see a qualified financial advisor.